we have many international teachers also. And the location of our campus is right in the city of Buffalo. Buffalo and the suburbs, it's a city of about 1 million people. It's the second largest city in New York State. And we are not New York City. We're actually about 7 hours by vehicle from New York City. But we are the second largest city in New York State, and it has a very small town feel because of how the city is centralized. And Buffalo State is in a beautiful part of the city of Buffalo. We have about 30 acres on our campus, and it's an older campus, so many of the buildings are beautiful. And we are known as an urban engaged campus, which means part of our mission is to be very integrated with the local community. We're fortunate that in our surrounding community, we have groups from many different countries that have settled in the United States. So we have immigrants from Central America, from various countries in Africa, from around the world, and they bring a nice flavor to the schools and of course the campus, and we try to collaborate as much as possible with them. And because of that, many of those students who graduate from high school come to Buffalo State to study. So at our university, the student body is also very diverse. And we also get a lot of students from New York City. It's just far enough away from home that they can take a bus and get home, but they're far enough away from mom and dad that they like coming to a smaller city to experience it. We have about 1,400 teacher candidates in different education programs on our campus. That's in a student population of about 10,000 students. So teacher education is one of the largest programs on campus. And like I said earlier, we are the place where if you want to be a teacher, you come study at Buffalo State. You might be able to see on the map there of the United States exactly where we're located. On the arrow, it's a little small, but New York City is on the East Coast, and Buffalo State is all the way west, 8 hours by car. In Buffalo, right on Lake Erie. We're very close to Niagara Falls, and we're considered to be the start of the Midwestern United States. So kind of the whole middle section of the country, that's the Midwest. Buffalo is seen as the start of that. So to talk a little bit, and I think I'm turning the reins over to Dr. Del Prado, so thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be here and so wonderful to know people are from across Chile. I'm very honored to be the co-director for our Professional Development Schools Consortium, which we call PDS. And it's the way that we connect the university to that local community that Dr. Schmidt was just talking about. So we seek to leverage common resources for mutually beneficial outcomes. And what we mean by that is that we think about resources in a variety of ways. So one of our most important resources are human resources. So the people who are preparing to become teachers, our students, their work in the classroom, in schools, in community agencies is so valuable and important. And we want to make sure that we help to navigate that and manage that in a way that it does benefit everyone, especially the children and the adolescents that they work with. Also important is the expertise. So the expertise of people in schools, the expertise of the faculty. And so when we bring all of that together, lots of really wonderful things can happen. We also think about resources in terms of time and space. And occasionally we hope to have some financial resources too, but honestly, that's really the smallest aspect. It's more about how we use this partnership to collaborate and build strong teachers and sustain strong teaching together through these partners. So when we think about the benefit, we're thinking about all of our stakeholders. So they include teacher candidates. So all the people that are in this group today, teacher candidates, classroom teachers, university faculty, building and district administrators, so the people like principals and directors. We think about pre-K through grade 12 children and their families and their communities. So we have about 100 school and community partners, and it's, as Raquel was saying, an incredibly diverse group. It allows us to provide so many different opportunities for our students. And those are local across the state. And we also partner internationally. So we're really fortunate to partner with Chile as well. So how this connects to the high leverage practices that we're going to be talking about is that it's our partners that help us think about ideas such as high leverage practices. They help us provide opportunities for our students to practice them. And they also provide opportunities for faculty to study. So our key questions that are going to guide us today are, what are high leverage practices, or what we call HLPs, and how can they be used in teacher preparation programs and in P-12 school settings? So we're interested in what they are at the conceptual level, as well as what they look like in practice and how we might use them to develop teachers who are effective in classrooms and sustain teachers as they work throughout their careers. So you can see here that we are defining high leverage practices. It's meant to be an action or task that's central to teaching. Carried out skillfully, these practices increase the likelihood that teaching will be effective for students learning. So that's the ultimate goal, is student learning. And so we've found that high leverage practices are a way for us to think deeply about what we do as teachers and how we might prepare new teachers to work effectively with students. So high leverage practices are what effective teachers do. They are meant to lead to student learning, and they provide a framework for talking about teaching, enacting teaching, and reflecting on teaching. So you can see here in the bullet points that we're interested in how high leverage practices are fundamental to support student learning, that they are practices that can be taught, they can be learned, they can be implemented by those who are starting the profession. We try to limit the number so it doesn't feel too overwhelming. There's so many things that teachers do. And high leverage practices allow us to give focus to a particular set of actions. They're research-based, so they're based on scholarly study that these practices have been found to be effective. They're used often by teachers during the school day, so we see evidence of them in many forms and by many people throughout the day. And they're applied broadly across age and grade levels, as well as diverse subject areas. So it isn't limited to just one content area.
So I'm going to just introduce a couple of the most commonly published sets of HLPs. And these are the two that we look at most closely at our work at Buffalo State. So the first list of HLPs or set of HLPs is the HLPs that have been published in 2010 by the University of Michigan Teaching Works. And those HLPs are designed for general education teachers. This set includes 19 different HLPs, and I'm going to show a couple examples of those on the next slide. And I have a link here. I believe this presentation will be shared with you after the fact. And so we have the link here where you can access those HLPs, and you'll find it again at the end of the presentation, along with some other resources that may be helpful to you in your work. So on the other side is the HLPs for special educators. So these are designed by the Council for Exceptional Children organization, which is, some of you may be aware, an international organization or body that is designed to be the kind of the professional body for special educators. So professional development around working with students with disabilities and exceptionalities. And so these were developed in 2017. There are 22 of them, and they actually have categories, 4 different categories under which the HLPs fall. So those categories are collaboration, assessment, social, emotional, behavioral, and instruction. The HLPs for general education are not organized under categories, but they have many of the same components. And so I'll show you some examples on the next slide. And when you look at both lists, we did provide you links to access both of them. You'll see a lot of overlap between the expectations for what we would consider high leverage practices for general education teachers working with sort of all students, and those for special education teachers that we might think of as more specific for working with students with disabilities. However, those of us that look at that set closely kind of feel that, you know, they're also, most of them, very applicable to working with all students, maybe just written in a way that they come sort of through the lens of a special education teacher versus a general education teacher. So just to provide a couple examples, we just selected a few. Under the general education side, HLP number 1 is leading a group discussion. So we're thinking about the ways that teachers approach instruction from a whole group perspective in general education, whereas sometimes in special education, we're thinking about things more in small groups or maybe grouping students by needs or abilities. But how do we lead a whole group discussion in a way that is effective? Number 14, designing single lessons and sequences of lessons. So being able to design an effective lesson plan, but also being able to link that to other lessons. And number 15, checking student understanding during and at the conclusion of lessons. So that's an example that we might think of under the category of assessment, or specifically formative assessment and summative assessment. How do we check in to make sure students are, following along and understanding during a lesson? And then how do we assess at the end of a lesson to see if the objectives of that lesson were met? On the special education side, a few examples. Number 1, collaborating with professionals to increase student success. So we know in special education, really, again, in all education, collaboration is important, but specifically in special education, many different types of teachers and service providers work with individuals with disabilities. And so they need to be able to collaborate effectively to meet those students' needs. Number 7, establishing a consistent, organized, and respectful learning environment. So we think about that in terms of classroom management and how a teacher sets up expectations and guidelines and rules and routines so that learning can take place in an effective way. And number 18, using strategies to promote active student engagement. So how do we use different approaches to make sure that students are actively involved in their learning? So again, these are just a few examples to illustrate for anybody who's new to the concept of HLPs, what they might look like. I also wanted to mention that these are just brief statements of the HLP. All of the HLPs have further descriptions as well. So for example, leading a group discussion, if you go on to the resources where you can find the HLPs, you can then click on it and see a paragraph description. And then you can also, in some of the resources we're going to provide, find further examples of practices that might fall under that heading, examples of what that might look like in a classroom, research support for that, high leverage practice, and so forth. So these are just the brief statements that encapsulate the idea of the HLP, but there's a lot more information about each of them to go into more depth in terms of the description. So the real part that we really wanted to focus on today is how we can use HLPs. So for those of you who have already been thinking and learning about HLPs, and those of you who just maybe recently, just now when we were sharing, learned what HLPs are, the next question is, so how would this apply within the work that you're doing, whether you're a teacher candidate studying to be a teacher, you're a practicing teacher or school administrator, or you're working in teacher preparation, perhaps as a university faculty. And so we are sharing these ideas partially from the literature on high leverage practices, but also specifically from the work that we've been doing at our college, because we've been using HLPs to frame some of our work for the past 6 to 8 years now in different ways. And so I'm going to suggest some of these ideas that you see here in the Venn diagram, and then give you a little bit of examples of how we've carried out that work at our particular college. So you can see on the left-hand side here for teacher preparation. So those of you who, like us, are working to prepare future teachers, the suggestions we have for how you could use HLPs in your work are that you could use HLPs as a framework for a new or revised teacher education program. So in other words, maybe you're at a point where you're just reconsidering or reconceptualizing a program that already exists, or you're developing a new teacher preparation program. How could you use HLPs to frame the coursework, the experiences out in the field, the assessments you're going to use with teacher candidates? So we suggest that you could use them in all of those ways. And the example that I would provide is that one of our undergraduate teacher preparation programs was undergoing revision in the past handful of years. And we decided to use high leverage practices as a framework for that program. So it was a multi-year process. And so because we have a very brief presentation, I'm going to just summarize in saying that what we did was we worked across departments, because this particular program includes coursework and leads to certification in both general education and special education. So we worked across our departments that are involved in that program to examine both the general education and special education HLPs, and come to agreement about which HLPs we would really focus on and how we might conceptualize them for a program that is preparing teachers in both general and special education. And then we use the HLPs as sort of an anchoring for the experiences and the courses that our candidates would take. So for example, when we developed, or we updated some old courses and developed some new courses, we had faculty teams looking at those courses and saying, okay, which HLPs would make sense to introduce in a particular course, to have candidates have opportunities to practice in a particular course, for us to assess on a program level in a particular course or experience such as student teaching. And so we really mapped out the HLPs across the program as we revised it. Now we're at the stage where we're actually implementing that program now. And so we're continuing to check in with instructors who are teaching within that program to make sure that they understand the role that HLP should be playing in the coursework and the field experiences and the student teaching, and continuing to develop the ways that we're going to make sure that we're sort of covering the HLPs in a basic sense, but also really focusing on the aspect of our candidates practicing the HLPs, and are they being assessed on their ability and their success with using the HLPs? Because the point of framing the program around HLPs is that rather than taking a more traditional approach of saying, okay, what do we need teachers to know? We want to say, what do we need teachers to be able to do? And so we want to focus on the actions that teachers have. And that's what HLPs have helped us to do within that program, to say, what do we need our teacher candidates and future teachers to be able to do when they are teachers? So even if you're not at a point where you're wanting to revise or revamp a whole entire program, you could just choose to use the language of high leverage practices to focus on skills in a particular class. So if you look at the list of high leverage practices and you think about the courses that you teach, you may say, you know, it's very likely that you sort of cover or introduce ideas that are under many of the different HLPs headings within a course. But you might say to yourself, in this course, I really want to focus on student engagement as an example. And so the language underneath that heading of HLP, that HLP about student engagement, might really provide some help to you in terms of how you would focus resources that are linked to that HLP that provide examples of practices and strategies that fall under that HLP could help you to focus in on that within your class. So if you're an individual faculty member that just sort of wants to start with using HLPs in your course, you could do it on that individual level. And then maybe you talk to a colleague who's also doing some of that work. And maybe that leads up to eventually the idea of trying to map them across an entire program. So in the P-12 setting, so for those of you that are practicing teachers or administrators, you can think about them in terms of a foundation for professional development. So if you're a practicing teacher, reading through the sets of HLPs might really help to give you sort of a framework for thinking about your own teaching practices and how you can maybe identify certain HLPs that you say, I feel really strong in that. Maybe I'm really good at student engagement. And maybe there's another area like leading a whole group discussion that you think that's something that I'd like to focus my own professional development on. Maybe I need some more strategies and techniques that have some research support to add to my teaching toolkit, so to speak. So you could use them for your own purposes, or as a school administrator or school leadership team, you might decide to use them to sort of maybe step back and assess your own school situation and context and faculty and say, okay, maybe there are some areas under these sets of HLPs that we could focus on in teams or as a school. Where we see that overlapping is in several different ways that we could share the work of using HLPs. So in that middle part of the Venn diagram, we see practice opportunities. So Pixita was introducing the idea of our professional development schools consortium and how we partner with our local schools. And that's really important in doing this work around HLPs, because when we at Buffalo State College are having our candidates learn about HLPs, and then we want to see those HLPs in action, we partner with our schools where our candidates are going out to do their field work and to do their student teaching, to make sure that we're having dialogue with them about affording our teacher candidates the proper opportunities within the classroom to practice those skills so that we can have them become more fluent in the skills, so that we can have opportunities to observe them and assess them and using those skills. So it's really important that we have those partnerships in that way. The shared language, what we found is that, and I'll actually combine this with the final bullet point of shared professional development opportunities. When we have partnered with our local schools, again, through our professional development schools consortium, using HLPs as a framework has allowed us to have common language for some of the things that we talk about in teaching. And so we can talk to our schools. We have an advisory council that oversees our professional development schools consortium, and we can talk about the needs that we both share in terms of professional development on the P-12 side, as well as teacher preparation at the college. And so what are some areas that we agree with, and we can use common language about something like student engagement, so that we're all using that same language when we talk about something that we want to focus on through professional development or focus on in our coursework at the college in terms of teacher preparation. So it really provides us opportunities to talk with our partner schools. And when we're both looking at HLP frameworks, we can use that language to talk about teaching and learning in similar ways. And even in the college, we have found that even when we're not speaking directly with our partners, when we're speaking with one another across departments, across different programs of teacher preparation, having that common language of the HLPs allows us to talk about things in ways that were challenging in the past, because sometimes we didn't always understand that we might have been talking about the same thing in terms of teaching and learning, but we might have been using different language and calling it, something different. And so having that set of HLPs allows us to take a look and say, oh yeah, that's, well, from the special ed perspective, we call a common example would be that we've talked about across general ed and special ed is ideas around explicit instruction. And that's one of the HLPs under the special education heading. But a lot of the strategies or techniques that fall under explicit instruction are things that were just maybe called something a little bit different in the general education framework. And so I know some of my colleagues would use the term gradual release of responsibility. And they weren't really thinking of that as how it related to explicit instruction, but taking a look at those HLPs and having those conversations has been really helpful for us to better understand each other's backgrounds and how we think about teaching and learning. So a lot of great opportunities have come out of this for us. I mentioned that we've done professional development with our partner schools through our PDS consortium. We have, for a couple years, we used HLPs as the overarching kind of framework for everything we did through our PDS consortium. So if it was an event where we had our school partners and along with faculty and teacher candidates from the college coming together to learn, we would frame that around one or more of the high leverage practices. We would survey our partner schools using the language of the high leverage practices to ask them about their needs and even their strengths as well, so that we know, what are good places to place our teacher candidates when we're looking to practice particular practices. So I'm going to leave it at that, but if you have questions about our work later, we're happy to come back to it.
So just to summarize what Angela said, so why are we using these? Why are HLPs better or different? How are they different from what we've been doing for many years of successfully preparing teachers? And again, that shift, when you think about studying in college or university to become a teacher, and you learn how to design a lesson plan, how to teach a lesson, how to assess, all those are important skills to have, but what does it actually look like in the classroom? What does it look like live? And a lot of times we hear from teacher candidates that when they read about it in the textbook and talk about it in their classes and do assignments and simulate, and then they go to teach a lesson, it can be a very different experience because children are not predictable. And we don't always know how a child is going to respond to a question that we ask, what question they're going to ask. So it really gives the focus on what teachers actually do. And again, the most critical skills, there's a lot that we need to know, but when we look at research, there are these skills, the HLPs, that rise to the surface again and again when we look at hundreds and thousands of teachers across the world. We find these set of common practices tend to be quite consistent. And as Angela said, also the shared language about what we're doing, whether you're teaching English language arts or science, it gives you that shared vocabulary because you may be doing very similar things to teach different content areas. Whether you're teaching preschool, pre-kindergarten, or high school, again, you may be doing similar things with groups. It's going to look different with the age group, but the practices are the same. So it gives us that way of communicating across content and age groups. So how do you get started? Again, knowing we have a large group with many different experiences and backgrounds in the classroom, a good place to start is decide where you want to use it. So if you're currently a university student, anywhere in your program, this is a great time for observation. So when you go into classrooms for class projects, when you're doing different student teacher type courses where you're in the schools, hopefully you get an opportunity just to sit back and watch an experienced teacher in action and see the types of things that they do. A lot of it seems very seamless because the teacher's been doing it and practicing it perhaps for a very long time and developing their skills. But this gives you the time without having to deliver the instruction perhaps to see HLPs in practice and how a teacher will adjust to situations and different groups of students and unpredictable things that can arise in the classroom. Those of you who are currently teaching, again, when you look at the list of HLPs, you'll say to yourself, I've been doing this for years, or of course I do these types of things. So it's good to start off by identifying what you're already doing, because it puts it in the framework of, okay, I can see how this works and how it fits into the overall framework of HLPs. different types of collaboration, whether it's team teaching or a tag team teaching with another student, another colleague, classroom, different type of class. So you want to identify what you're already using and then think about, okay, I've heard about this perhaps, but I haven't had the chance to practice it, or I'm not familiar with it, but it looks like it could be good for my classroom. So identify, start with what you're familiar with. And then you can think about, well, I've been wanting to try this. So this is your opportunity to extend beyond what you're comfortable and familiar with to trying some new practices. So thinking about with the populations that you work with, as Angela said, the HLPs in general education and special education are very similar. What you see in the 22 HLPs in special education is they tend to be a little bit more specific, because we know with children with disabilities, in general, they need something a little different, a little more than what general education students need. So this helps you kind of focus in on how you can select different practices for different groups of students in your classroom. So it's a good idea to choose one to focus on, because I think if you look at all of them at the same time, it's overwhelming. Because again, in special education, there are 22 different practices. So let's say you decide to focus on, I like to do group work in my classroom. I think that they like the social aspect of it. They're engaged. It helps with behavior management. So I'm going to focus on when I tell them to work with partners, maybe one other classmate or 3 or 4 other classmates, how can I design my groups to be most effective and maximize instructional time? So of course you research it. Now with the wonderful world of the internet and Google, there are so many resources out there, and of course professional development, that you can learn more about it, about the high leverage practice, and also see different examples of it being used in video on the internet. And think about how it relates to your own class. So you want to think about, for your lesson planning, how you're going to use it. And if you're new to HLPs, as with anything, you want to be more specific starting out to see how it's going to look in the classroom. So let's say you plan a lesson and you decide that you're going to incorporate an aspect of group work that you haven't used in the past. For you yourself, you really want to list out step by step exactly what you're going to do throughout the lesson. And then obviously as you use it more and more, you'll be more flexible and comfortable with it. And then of course, what we do in teaching is we use data. So see how it worked. How did the students respond? Did they seem to increase the amount of content that they learned or the amount of work that they completed? Did they seem more engaged? Again, a big thing for students, fewer behavior problems is a good indication that they were on task and enjoying the lesson. And you think about, okay, I'm going to do this next time, but I'm going to change this a little bit, or I'm going to change my grouping in this way because I know this student struggles in this particular area. So it really allows you to pinpoint how you can manage it moving forward for the students in your classroom.
We're at the point of the presentation where we're going to get to questions and discussion, but I'm actually, Tamara, while you're organizing that, I'm just going to skip ahead and show the next 2 slides, which are references and resources, and then we can come back to questions, just to make sure that I point out what's available. And because it ties into what Raquel was just sharing about sort of researching the practices and implementing them. So real quickly, I doubt you can even see this, it's so small on your screen, or at least it is on mine. But this PowerPoint, I believe, will be shared with you, so you can have access to this. The first section here is the special education HLP list and some additional resources that go along with that. And then the next section is the general education HLPs with some additional resources. So these are links that you can click, and you'll find that, as I said before, it's not just the list or the set of HLPs, but further descriptions, links to additional research and strategies and ideas that fall under these categories. In some cases, video examples to show the HLPs in action. So a lot of great content for both the special education list and the general education list. The next set is a few foundational references. So if you're new to learning about HLPs, or you just really want to dig in a little bit and learn more about where they came from and the thinking behind HLPs and their uses in education, you might want to check out some of these articles if you have access to them. And if not, that might be something that we could help you with. And then on the next slide, this IRIS website is from the Vanderbilt University, and they have a lot of great resources just in general, but a lot of their resources align with HLPs, and there's an alignment guide on their website that shows how different resources such as learning modules, information briefs, activities align under the HLPs, so that if you're using HLPs for professional development or in your teacher preparation program, you can find a lot of great resources for teaching them and how they fall under those categories of HLPs if you go to this link. And then lastly, there are a selection of some of the works that we've published. Myself and my colleagues at Buffalo State have done a lot of work around HLPs, as we mentioned. And so if you're interested in some of the things that I talked about earlier about how we reframed our program or how we've worked with our partners in the schools around HLPs, you might want to check out some of these works. And if there's something that you're interested in and you don't have access to it, let us know. You could send us an email. Our emails are listed in the beginning of the PowerPoint where we had our introduction slide, and we'd be happy to try to help you to share these resources. So I will go back and see if we have questions.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Patty, Dr. Belprado, and Dr. Schmidt. And of course, I do want to thank the translator as well. We have over 70 people that are connected. So we'll ask you please to post your questions in the question and answer box. And we'll go ahead with at least one first question of Noelia, I believe it was, that asked if you could provide an example of a high leverage practice, like a very concrete one that probably we work throughout preschool to 12th grade.
So yeah, I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, am I back on the examples page? Okay. So we did share this earlier in the presentation, but I think that the question might be asking to go a little bit deeper than this. So these are the examples. So if you're asking what is a high leverage practice, these are high leverage practices. So by definition, this is the published set for general education out of the University of Michigan, a couple examples from that set. And this is a couple examples from the special education set. However, most of them are not what you might consider a practice itself, but sort of a category under which other practices fall. So it's a little bit confusing in that way. So for example, I can speak to HLP number 18 from the special education list. So one of the things that we know that teachers do, that is something, going back to our definition of high leverage practices, this is something that can be taught and learned by teachers entering the field. This is something that is used frequently throughout the school day. This is something that we believe has a high impact on student learning, right? Using strategies to promote active student engagement. So if you are a teacher, or you're going to be a teacher, or you're teaching teachers, this is something that should be really central, right? So how am I, or those that I'm working with, going to use strategies to promote active student engagement? So to answer the question, that is the high leverage practice. However, when you're thinking about what does that actually look like in the classroom, we need to be more specific, right? So for most of them, that's why I encourage you to go to those references and resources to dig in a little bit deeper, to say, okay, I really want to think about how I use strategies to promote active student engagement. What teaching strategies are research-based that I can use that make sense for my maybe grade level, my content area, my teaching and learning context that promote active student engagement. So for example, unison responding is an example of something that has research base. The use of response cards, whether that be right on individual whiteboards or holding up letter A, B, C, D, or today using a lot of different forms of technology to have students respond to polls live during teaching during a lesson. So those are examples. A wide variety of different grouping strategies could also fall under engagement, because a lot of times when studies are done to investigate the use of collaborative learning models, they're looking at the ways that they promote academic achievement, but also the ways that they engage students and have students on task learning and reduce problematic behaviors during a lesson. So those are all examples, and I'll let my colleagues chime in if they want to answer any more on this question, but hopefully that provides an overview that yes, these are the practices, but then you've got to dig a little bit deeper about what does it actually look like. And because we only had such a short presentation today, I'm sorry that we didn't go into more depth. But
one area that we've that some of our colleagues have looked at is how the Kagan structures help to engage and promote active student engagement. And so I'd encourage you also to look for examples of Kagan structures, which you can find when you do some research on the internet. And it's Spencer Kagan's work. And there are a variety of activities that promote equal engagement. So that's a very important piece, that it's not just engagement of a small group of students, but students across the entire class. And so one of the things that I really like about using the HLPs is it helps us, as it's been discussed, it helps give us a common language. But it helps us to think more deeply about what is truly important in the work that we do as teachers, and how we can give a laser focus to one area and think about all the ways that we can prepare our new teachers and sustain our practicing teachers. Oh, thank you for writing it in the chat.
Great, thank you. There are more questions, so I'll place them. I forgot the name. Sorry about the person who is stating it. Dolores mentions, do you have sample videos of specific high leverage practice implementations in real classroom settings at any of the schools you work with that we could resort to?
so on the resources that we shared on that final slide, there are examples. Those aren't our examples though. Those are from the Council for Exceptional Children published some. They are from real schools, as well as the University of Michigan for the general education. Some of them are maybe simulations where it's, a mock situation, and some of them are in real teaching and learning situations. So we don't have them from our own schools to share with you, but maybe that's something that we could work on in our future work. So thank you for that question.
Oh, great. There are many questions popping up. So Mr. Hadba asks, what HLP would you recommend for teachers that work with 10-year-old students using English as a foreign language?
Go ahead, Pixie. Did you?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. So my first thought was, I don't know if I could make a recommendation, because I think it would have to be in your classroom, but because I think it's, what's going well for you, what's not going well for you. So maybe, something to think about and looking at the list and asking yourself that question. However, when I'm looking at just a few examples that we actually shared on the slide, I'm thinking that checking student understanding during and at the conclusion of lessons comes from the general education list, although we do have something similar in the special education list as well. And I think that would be really critical. So looking at specific ways that you can be assessing throughout a lesson, not just sort of teaching a lesson or a unit of instruction and then waiting to assess at the end, but in what ways. And some of that has a lot of overlap with those engagement strategies that we just talked about as well. So something like the use of response boards, again, falls under the idea of engagement, but also formative assessment or checking in on student understanding. So Pixita, I think you might have had another suggestion as well.
Yeah, so when I think about a language classroom, the chance to practice is so important to the development of those skills. And so that engagement piece is allows us to think about the ways that we increase student talk time and reduce the amount of teacher talk time. And so what I like about the high leverage practices is that it helps us have those conversations with our teacher candidates who may be experienced classrooms where students didn't do a lot of talking. And so this allows us to say, research supports more engagement, more student talk time, and this is what it might look like. And this is what it might look like among 10-year-olds as we have these conversations when we are looking at very specific classrooms. But in particular for language classrooms, the more that students can produce the language through speaking and through writing, those are ways that we're engaging them, and those are really important ways that we help them. We lead to better student outcomes as a result of that.
I would just also add real quickly, one of the other general education ones that came to mind is, I wanted to look up the exact wording, but choosing and using representations, examples, and models of content. So that's one that you could read a little bit more about. Because I think that's really important in language teaching and learning as well. So that making sure that, as students are developing those language skills and their, the concepts around learning new language, that can be really important.
Great. There's another question. Yay. It comes from Javiera Rios. She mentioned she's making reference to the 4 aspects of practice, the social, emotional, behavioral that you had previously explained in high leverage practices. And if you could explain an example of how you work that with the students at school.
So I can hop in here. Obviously, the positive reinforcement is a big part of working with general and special education students. So with teacher candidates, we try to really have them be aware of their language. A lot of times, especially with newer teachers, they don't realize the language that they use. And we have to think about positive to corrective feedback. So how to give students corrective feedback in a positive way, where they're still receiving a great deal of positive reinforcement throughout the lesson and throughout their school day. So Angela mentioned earlier this notion of representation, and I think it's very important. One of the things we know with social and emotional learning is that students seeing representations of themselves in the content in the lesson. So whether it's language, culture, skin color, different interests that the student might have, things that they're seeing in their home environment that they may not see represented in the classroom as frequently, that teachers make a point of explicitly bringing in those backgrounds of their students into the teaching materials. Because a lot of times in the textbooks and the classroom materials, children don't see themselves represented. So just those very subtle ways of representation of your students that are in your class helps build their positive identity, which therefore leads to more positive behaviors. So it's part of the creating the classroom community and the culture of your classroom by making sure that your individual students are represented across different aspects of their culture.
Very interesting. There are actually one piece of news and a question just to round up a little, okay? Based on the videos that one of the participants asked, which of course you already answered, I have been informed that there are some videos that are placed in the website of the university from the practicum of early childhood education at Universidad del Desarrollo that you can access as well. I placed the link in the chat so that you can all access. So do, okay, enjoy them. And there are some more resources besides those tips that have been provided by our experts. And one last question really to round up. How do you go about teacher trainees that know everything about, in this case, what the high leverage practices are, but to implement them in the school or in the classroom where not necessarily the school is aimed towards high leverage practices?
We're all thinking that's a great question.
It is a good question.
Well, I think because I spoke about this a little bit, this is one of the great things about high leverage practices is you are already doing it. If you've taught a lesson in a classroom, I guarantee you've already used HLPs. It's just thinking about it in the HLP framework. So I would say start off with what's familiar to you and think about why it works. Why does this work so well? Because what works well with one group of students could not work at all with another group of students. It doesn't mean that it's not an HLP. It's just we're always looking at the context, the situation. So I think starting from there and then reaching out to other professionals in your school, other teachers, other administrators, who you can find that common bond with so that you have someone to collaborate and discuss with, bounce ideas off of, those types of things. And I'll let my colleagues kick in here because I'm sure they have a lot of thoughts too.
I think like Raquel says, this chance to use them for reflection. So maybe I've made, I do these things, but I'd like to get more skilled with making sure that I'm doing them with all of my students. So maybe they're effective for a group of my students, but not everyone in the class. And so the chance to use this language, use this framework to think about how I could look at my own practice and make changes. And then I think Raquel's suggestion that you find people to collaborate and talk with is really important. And it gives you something, words and a language and a framework to have those conversations.
I noticed something in the chat where someone was talking about using talk moves, and that's a great example of HLP number 1. I agree. So, it's an example of a strategy that you use to lead a whole group discussion, so that it's not just I'm the teacher talking and the students are listening, but in what ways, and not even just this, the students sharing is a first step, but talk moves is a great example of how they can share. So it's sort of a routine that you can use within your class to lead a whole group discussion. I really like that example.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to add to that last question. If I understand, I think the person was asking a little bit about, if we're having our teacher candidates, we want them to practice in the classroom and maybe those strategies aren't always in place. I think that, we can have our teacher candidates ask their mentor teachers, in what ways do you lead a whole class discussion? And in what ways do you use student engagement? Or, I learned a new strategy for student engagement. I'm going to try that in a lesson. And I think our best mentor teachers that we all like to use are looking to our teacher candidates to learn new strategies and ideas and, add to their skills as well. And so, just having kind of a gentle back and forth between, those supervising from the college perspective, those out in the field, and we learn from them as well. So, teachers are using strategies and techniques that, we aren't familiar with. So we can just kind of use the HLP language to say, oh, okay, so you do this, and that's related to student engagement. Here's something that, we teach in our program that's related to student engagement. And we can all kind of come together knowing that we're all bringing something to the table. So it's not that someone's doing it and someone's not. we're all doing these things, but how can we frame them in a way that brings us together rather than kind of serves to divide us? So.
No, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate and thank you for this enlightening talk, which actually has kept everyone engaged. We still have the same audience from the beginning, so everyone is really interested. And I'm sure if there are other types of questions, we can actually try to answer or ask you and establish that connection as well. So I really thank you for being here, for sharing your knowledge with us, and as well to all of the audience and our translator as well. So thank you very much to everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
So we can see everyone saying goodbye. That's great.